Hi, I'm Kalela Williams, and I'm here in Philadelphia exploring the life of a historical figure whose work is often unsung. That, however, has changed with Opera Philadelphia's piece, Save the Boys. It's an operatic rendition of an 1887 poem with music composed by Tyshawn Sorey and performed by countertenor John Holliday and pianist Grant Lanig. But who was the poet? Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and what traces did she leave in Philadelphia? Join me as I journey through Philadelphia and find out.
Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a poet and a novelist, but she was also an abolitionist, an activist, and a suffragist. Born in 1825, she grew up in Baltimore in the shadow of her abolitionist caregivers, her aunt and uncle Henrietta and William Watkins. As a young woman, she worked as a nursemaid and a seamstress, and later a teacher. Many cities have a claim to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, including Columbus, Ohio, and York, Pennsylvania.
But it's here in Philadelphia where Frances Ellen Watkins Harper also left an enduring impact during the last decades of her life. So I'm actually standing in front of her former home on 1006 Bainbridge Street. And the look of this building has changed from the original, but in 1887, when Frances Ellen Watkins Harper wrote Save the Boys, it may have been inside this building. In her earlier years, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would have lived here at the home of William and Letitia Still on 9th and Bainbridge.
William Still was called the father of the Underground Railroad. He was a coal merchant, but he was also a busy abolitionist who worked with Harriet Tubman and others.
In fact, the Institute for Colored Youth was located in the 7th Ward, a thriving community of African Americans during the 19th century. And Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would have been supportive of the mission of the Institute for Colored Youth. Originally located near 7th and Lombard Streets, it moved here to Bainbridge Street in 1866, not far from William Still's house. So I'm here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and they've got a fantastic collection of African American history and documents related to Philadelphia's African American life. So let's see what kind of materials they have that relate to the life of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Poems on miscellaneous subjects. This is one of her earlier works, and it is what it sounds like, poems on miscellaneous subjects. What I think is interesting about this document is its title. That's because it's similar to Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral by Phillis Wheatley. And of course we know that Phillis Wheatley was an 18th century black poet, and she published her work in London because she couldn't find a publisher here, but she was born enslaved. And to me, there's no doubt that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper drew inspiration from Phillis Wheatley in her writing. The style of her writing, of course, is consistent with her time, but also is mirroring or echoing that of Phillis Wheatley's. The subjects of her work also echo many of the subjects of Phillis Wheatley. So I find this just an incredible talking point. It's almost like these two generations are speaking to one another. Moving forward, Sketches of Southern Life. This was a work that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper did after traveling to the rural South later in the 1800s. And what she saw in the South, and of course she grew up in Baltimore, she had never really traveled much further south than that. And what she saw during this extended trip was she saw violence. She saw racially motivated violence, and she became an advocate for male suffrage because she believed that when black men had the right to vote, they could help mitigate this violence with more political power. But what she also saw was violence against women. So she saw violence within the black community. And this sealed her commitment to temperance. At that time, the idea of temperance wasn't, let's just abolish alcohol to abolish alcohol. The idea of temperance was to protect women in many cases. It was the idea that many folks had around temperance was, not everyone, but the idea that many folks had around temperance was that alcohol fueled violence against women. It fueled domestic violence. And Frances Ellen Watkins Harper believed that. And so we see her we see her involvement within this movement here. So moving forward a bit in time, we have Enlightened Motherhood, an address that she made to the Brooklyn Literary Society. This was in 1892, so this would have been when she lived in Philadelphia. She would have gotten on a train and traveled to Brooklyn. Now, this to me speaks to more than just what the address is about, but it speaks to this idea of travel. Throughout Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's life, she was constantly mobile. She was constantly moving around, and travel at that time was very fraught. She would have had to deal with segregated trolleys, segregated trains, trolleys that wouldn't even let her sit down, and she fought against this. In one case, one famous case, she actually refused to leave her seat and was physically manhandled by the conductor, and she actually her arm was hurt. So this to me, again, it says more than the fact that she made this address. It's this idea of her traveling, in many cases alone, and having to navigate this racist system of travel. Moving forward here, these are some documents that I really like. This is a handbill, Poetical Readings by Mrs. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and it is what it sounds like. It's an event in which she is going to read her poetry, and this was dating back from 1867, so it was before she actually purchased a house in Philadelphia, but she would have, of course, traveled here frequently, and she at one point did live with William Still, who is on the committee here. William Still was called the father of the Underground Railroad, as we know, and he is on this committee here, as well as Robert Adger, Reverend Weaver, Reverend Smith, other big players within the Philadelphia's Black community. And what this to me speaks of, we've got this ticket here too, 15 cents. Folks would have paid 15 cents to hear her read. So we have a few different ideas. We have poetry as an event. We have this idea of a poetry reading as an event for the broader Black public in Philadelphia, which I, as someone who loves literature, just really loves this idea of. It's not just what I call poetry nerds coming here, it's the broader public coming to hear her read and paying for the experience. But we also have this glimpse into the Black social scene in Philadelphia at that time period, which was a very vibrant and active scene. We tend to have this idea of history that people just stayed home and knitted, and that's not the case. People were out and about. They were maybe even out and about more than we are because they had less to do at home. There were no televisions. There was no internet. You couldn't play games on your phone. You didn't have a phone. If you want to see somebody, you have to go and visit. So, or you have to hang out with them maybe at a poetry reading. So this to me, again, this is just one aspect of the very active Black social scene that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would have been a part of, either as a speaker or as a guest. And lastly, we've got this portrait of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. It is taken later in her life, and to me, this is just an incredibly beautiful portrait because the expression on her face is one of contentment and an understanding that the work that she did was to a greater good. It was to a good larger than herself. And I think she understood that. I think there's no way she didn't understand that. But I think that it also is an expression, it's a far-seeing expression of work that needs to be done. She's looking outwards, and there's an idea that she and her generation couldn't do it all by themselves. They were building off the legacies of others. We saw how she might have drawn inspiration from Phyllis Wheatley, for instance, but there was an understanding that other generations, later generations, would need to pick up where she left off and where her generation left off. So I find this really incredibly moving and inspirational. It inspires me as I think about how I want to leave the world. And I hope that it inspires others too. So I'm here at the Library Company of Philadelphia looking at some artifacts related to the life of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And what we have here is we have the report of the International Council of Women from the National Women's Suffrage Association. This was an event that would have happened in Washington, D.C. in 1888. And what this represents to me is it represents Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's dedication to winning the right to vote for women. But Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was not necessarily in alignment with many other women who were involved in the suffragist movement, in the suffrage movement, because that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper believed in the priority of Black men having the right to vote, because, of course, of the racial violence that she saw in the South, which we talked about previously. But she was committed to winning women the right to vote, and we can see here this frontispiece. We can see a little bit more clearly that this is Lucretia Mott. If I can turn this page very carefully. Lucretia Mott, who was a contemporary of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and a name that's really known within that suffrage community. And Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, of course, would have rubbed elbows with many big names within the suffrage movement. Moving forward, we have two different editions of Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, which is a novel that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper wrote. This is a third edition. This was published in 1892. It is, of course, dedicated to her daughter, Mary E. Harper. And what we have here is we have another edition that was published in 1988. To me, these editions talk to each other. They talk to each other in the sense of different generations appreciating her work and reading her work differently. In the 1980s, we did have a renewed appreciation of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's work. We had, of course, a renewed appreciation of Black literature in general. Not that appreciation ever went away, but it was just a bigger push to maybe bring up some names that might have been lost in the shuffle of other Black literary figures. And what I think here is that this book really resonates because that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is not a person who we're often taught about in school. I didn't learn about her until I was in my 30s. I didn't know that she ever existed. No one ever taught me about her in school or even in college. So to me, her work is really resonant. A lot of what she talks about resonates with us today. And so it's really crucial that we still continue to study her work. And looking closely at this book, we can see that there is, of course, we can see this was published by the Schomburg Center at the New York Public Library, and we can also see that there's this beautiful image, this beautiful silhouette of a Black woman with natural hair. Now, in the 1980s, that wasn't exactly the big natural hair movement for Black women, but this is a very Afrocentric image that really positions this book within a conversation about Black pride and that pride, how that resonates within Black literature, including unearthing names, again, that may have been lost. Moving forward, we've got poems on miscellaneous subjects, like what we saw at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This is a slightly earlier edition. This was published in 1854. Now, I'm not going to open this very delicate edition here, but there is a poem inside titled On Christianity, because, of course, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a devout Christian. But it's here at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia where she practiced what she preached.
Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a member of this church during her years in Philadelphia. In the 1870s, she would have worshipped at their original location on 10th and Locust Streets. In the 1880s, the congregation moved to a building near 21st and Chestnut Streets, one designed by famed architect Frank Furness.
So I'm here at Eden Cemetery in Collingdale, Pennsylvania, and I am at the resting place of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Now, what is interesting here is that we actually have two burial stones devoted to her memory. We have this one that was erected by the First Unitarian Church. It was erected a little bit later. And we see on this stone that there are lines from her poem, "Bury Me in a Free Land." And we also have this stone here, which is the actual marker of her burial site. This is where Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was laid to rest. This is where she's buried. She lived a legacy-filled life. She was a suffragist, an abolitionist. She fought for civil rights, for women's rights. She fought for things that we all enjoy, for privileges that many of us all have. And I owe so much of what I have to her. We have a long way to go, but it's because of her, this unsung hero, that we have so much of what we do, and I'm forever thankful. Thank you so much for joining me for this exploration into the life of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper.